Welcome to the LBF Church podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him in all the ways that he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and today we're going to talk about the book of Genesis, and specifically about Genesis 1 and the creation story. Now, if you're a part of LBF Church, and if you're watching this right when we're releasing it, we've just begun a series through Genesis. And one of the things that comes up when we walk through Genesis 1 is just the question of how are we meant to take this creation narrative that we get in Genesis 1? And especially in light of new scientific knowledge or new scientific consensus that we have, and how are we meant to sort of mesh what we believe to be scientific knowledge with what we get from the Bible? So I want to spend some time talking about how we deal with this creation account. And then also I want to recommend some resources, because as I'm going to talk about, I'm not a guy who's an expert on science. I'm not going to pretend to be that at all. But I have read some books that I found very helpful on this subject that I want to recommend for those of you who feel like I need a little bit more help. I want to delve a little bit deeper into this. So for starters, I just want to say, when we're talking about Genesis 1, I think the first thing that we've got to ask is, what is the key question that we're trying to discern the answer to? And for some people, I think the key question is, how is it that I can fit what I read in Genesis 1 about these 6 days of creation? How can I fit that into what I've already come to believe about the universe and about the origins because of scientific consensus? And what I want to say is, I think that's actually the wrong approach to this. I think it's the wrong approach for us to say, we've got this information on Genesis 1, but how can we read this in a way that it fits what we've already come to believe? And I think it's the wrong approach for probably at least 3 reasons. The first reason why I think it's not smart to do it this way is because scientific consensus can be a moving target. So I think that if we as Christians set ourselves up where we say it is incumbent upon us, we must figure out a way that our faith fits with the scientific consensus. The hard thing is, we could get to the point that we might be able to read Genesis 1 in a way that we say, yeah, we fit it in, but if scientific consensus shifts, then we're going to have to abandon that and read Genesis 1 through new eyes. So it's not our goal to track down and chase scientific consensus. Reason number 2 why I think that this is not a really good approach is because it ignores the fact that while we as Christians are not anti-science, we all should recognize that science has limitations. Science is about us looking at the world as it is now and then doing experiments in a controlled atmosphere, and then from that trying to figure out what things might have been like in the past. That's great, and there are things that we can discover, and at the same time, we just got to recognize, well, there's limits to this. It is one thing for us to say, we know that the world is round. We have had the opportunity to send people out into space and to take photographs and take video, and we have good reason to believe this. When we're talking about things that happened thousands or millions of years ago, we've got to just realize we should be talking about that with a great amount of humility and with much less certainty. I remember I was listening or I was watching a YouTube video several months ago, and somebody on it was talking about what the weather patterns were like on the Earth 120,000 years ago. And they were talking about it with a level of confidence. These are what the weather patterns were like 120,000 years ago. Now, once again, I'm not the science expert, but I just remember hearing that and saying, I don't know everything about science, but what I do know is this. We don't know what the weather patterns were like on this earth 120,000 years ago. We may be able to theorize about it, and we might even come up with the right answer. We won't know if we've come up with the right answer, but the idea that we could act like we know something like that with certainty is, when it comes down to it, a little bit silly. I remember listening to another podcast where the person I was listening to was talking about the idea that 350 million years ago, we all were lobsters. That's basically where we were in the evolutionary process. And I understand that there's a line of thinking that kind of traces all of that. But at the same time, for me, the idea of just making that as a conclusive statement, to me, we should recognize with humility when we're making theories about things that happened thousands or millions of years ago, we've got to take that with humility. Science doesn't tell us conclusively about the past. What it instead does, it tells us, in this situation, here's how these things work. And so if we extrapolate it out, we might be able to come up with a good, solid hypothesis about how things worked in the past, or about how old the world is, or about the order in which things came about. So that's the second reason why we shouldn't just try to chase scientific consensus. The third reason is this. If we approach Genesis and say, well, how do we fit this into what we already believe? That's just a bad approach to the Bible in general. We as Christians believe that the Bible is God's word. We believe that the Bible is authoritative because God gave it to us. And so on an issue of morality, if we were to do this, we would recognize, I think, pretty quickly, this is not a good way to read the Bible. And in fact, maybe I shouldn't say we'd realize pretty quickly, because there are people today that have this same basic approach and say, all right, here's what we know. What we know is a man and a man having a romantic relationship is no different than a woman and a man having a romantic relationship. There's nothing different. It's just as moral. It's just as beautiful. It's just as good to have a homosexual romantic relationship and to have a heterosexual romantic relationship. That's what we know. And so then when we read different passages in the Bible, we have to figure out how those don't violate what we know. And those of us who are Bible-believing Christians, if we were to hear that line of thinking, what we should say is, well, no, actually, the Bible gets to correct what we think we know. If we believe that the Bible is authoritative and that God's word is authoritative, then that means that we question, we say, well, we thought we knew this. This intuitively made sense to me. I just kind of assumed that this was true, but God has the right to correct it for me. And that certainly is true of issues of origin as well. If we say, well, we know what happened, first of all, we got to say, well, we don't know what happened. And secondly, we've got to be able to approach the Bible saying, God gets to correct what we think we know. We got to go with God on this. Now, that said, this is why I think, those three reasons are the reasons why I think it's not good to start with the question, how do I fit Genesis 1 into what I already have come to know or believe about the world or about origins? I think instead, the right question just for us to ask is, what is Genesis 1 saying and what does it mean? We should take it on its own and just look at this passage of Scripture and saying, what is it saying? What is it teaching? And if you were here for the first sermon that we did on the book of Genesis, I talked a little bit about this, but I'll say within kind of the Bible-believing community, there would be three main views on how we take Genesis 1. And so I'll walk through those, and then I'll take a little bit of time to tell you why I've landed where I've landed. So view number one would be the view that would say, because there are these 6 days of creation that are explained in Genesis chapter 1, what we should believe is that God created the universe in 6 24-hour days. After all, that's sort of what's laid out here. We have evening and we have morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. Now, this has some advantages. This view definitely has some advantages. One of the advantages is it's taking Genesis 1 pretty straightforwardly, saying, here's what it says. We're just going to take it for what it says. After all, it's not a problem for God. God is able to do this. God is certainly able to create in 6 24-hour days. He doesn't need any time at all, in fact. So for us to say, well, that couldn't have happened. No, that absolutely could have happened. That's not a problem that God could have done that. Another thing that lends itself to this is that some people will say, well, but the earth appears to be much older than thousands of years. And by the way, on this, some people take this to say, if you believe in 6 24-hour days, then that means that you believe the earth is sort of exactly 6,000 and some years old. I say that is false. That's done by that number is come up with by tracing the genealogies in Genesis. That is a foolish way to go about things because genealogies are known to have gaps in them. The assumption is not that we're going exactly from one father to one son and one son to one son. The idea is that we're just showing kind of the broad genealogy. So even if we knew that these were 6 24-hour days, we still wouldn't know how old the earth is. But we would be talking about a younger earth. We'd be talking about thousands of years instead of millions of years. That seems pretty clear. That said, God creates in Genesis 1 with maturity. He doesn't create an embryo, he creates a man. He doesn't create seed, he creates grass. He creates things with sort of apparent age. And so because of that, it's possible that the way that God created the world was with apparent age because he created things in a mature state instead of just an embryonic state where they had to kind of come from nothing to something. Now, there's also within this, there are some people that take the 6 24-hour days, but also say there was a gap or there are gaps between the days. So some people will say, all right, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:2, now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then verse 3 is where we have the first day, and let there be light. Now, some people will say, all right, well, there was a gap between God creating everything in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and between him beginning to form and fill the earth in these 6 days of creation. I would just say, I don't think there's any problem with that. That absolutely could have been true. There's no direct timeline saying immediately then this is what God did. God is also not bound by time, so that's not a problem. That could have been something that God did. And then sometimes they'll also say there could have been gaps between the days because it doesn't say the very next day God did this. I'll just say for me, that's possible. That view would not be the result of a straightforward reading of Genesis chapter 1. It's possible that happened. Genesis 1 doesn't say that didn't happen, but it's not something we would come up with. It's something that we come up with because we say we want to understand, we want to make this compatible with what we see in science. So it's not impossible that that's what went on, but it's certainly not overtly taught. Now, there are some advantages, as I said, to reading Genesis 1 that way. The disadvantage to it is that it definitely would seem to go against the current scientific consensus. So we can at least acknowledge that. Doesn't mean it's untrue, but it definitely means that we're siding against the large scientific consensus with that belief about the age of the earth and with certain other things about the order of creation. All right, so that's view number 1, that this is 6 literal 24-hour days. View number 2 would be that what we've got in Genesis 1 is a more artistic retelling of what God did in creation. So this isn't a view that says this stuff didn't really happen, this is just a poem. But instead, what's being said is God did create everything out of nothing, but what we get in Genesis 1 is not a strict historical sequence of what he was doing, but rather an artistic way of talking about the fact that God created every different sort of thing and that he created it all with order. And there might be some of you that are listening to this and saying, well, that's too loosey-goosey. That's taking the Bible and sort of making it into what I want it to be. And I would just say, I understand that danger, and I think that we can sometimes get into a danger when we deliteralize the Bible like this view would do. At the same time, there are parts of the Bible that are more clearly poetic. When we read the book of Job, we understand that this is a poetic book. And so I mentioned this on the Sunday sermon, but I read Job. In fact, I'm reading Job right now in my personal quiet times. When I read the book of Job, I believe that Job was a real man and that these events really happened. But I also don't think that when he and his friends sat around talking about things, they spoke in poetry to each other. I don't think that what we have recorded in Job is meant to be something where we say, these are exact quotes from this instance. It's a poem. Similarly, when we get into some of the Psalms and we hear different analogies that God is a rock, we don't have a problem with saying, well, that's clearly not literal. Sometimes poetry, that there's a more artistic view to this. So I would just say I'd caution against looking at this and saying, well, anybody that would take a more artistic view to this is just abandoning the Bible. I would say, actually, there's some things in Genesis 1 that I think point towards the fact that this might be going on. It's not clearly what's going on, but it might be what's going on. The first thing that might point to it is this. In day 1, we get light. It's not until day 4 that we get the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, God can shed light on the world without those things. God is God. He can do whatever he wants. Some people even kind of theorize God himself is light, which is a theme throughout the whole Bible. So that's fine. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying if we're looking at this and saying, well, there was light on the world in day 1, but there wasn't sun, moon, and stars until day 4, that at least could make us think maybe the point of this is not to show a strict historical sequence, but to show the different elements of creation and how God formed and then he filled. Another thing that could lend itself to the idea that this is a more poetic viewing is the fact that Genesis 1 is pretty different than the rest of Genesis. Some people will talk about Genesis 1 through 11 sort of being a distinct unit in the book of Genesis, which in a sense is true because Genesis 1 through 11 deals kind of broadly with human history, and then starting in Genesis 2, it zeroes in on Abraham and then follows through to the patriarchs, and we get kind of the beginning of Jewish history. So it is true that Genesis 1 through 11 is unique, but Genesis 2 through 11 is pretty similar to Genesis 12 through 50. Genesis 1, however, is different in the way that it's laid out. It's a more kind of artistic way that things are laid out. So there are some things that point towards this. So the advantages would be that, all right, there's some evidence that this might be the case. There's a straightforward way to read Genesis 1 in this sense. Another advantage is that this would take away some of the needs for us to feel like we've got to fit this into a scientific model. We could say, well, that's not really the purpose of it. It's not talking about age of the earth. A disadvantage to this view, though, would simply be that it's not quite as straightforward. You do have to take some liberty. You do have to try to figure out what's artistic and what's real and what's not. So it has the advantage of not having to find this deep, strict compatibility with science, but it has the disadvantage of the idea that maybe it's not quite as straightforward. The third view that I want to talk about is the view that's often called day age. So this is the idea that we've got 6 days of creation, but the word day, the Hebrew word yom, doesn't always mean 24-hour day. Now, that's true. The majority of the time it does mean 24-hour day, but there are times where it just means a period of time. Like the day of the Lord being spoken of in the Old Testament isn't necessarily speaking of a day, but a period of time. And there's other times that it's used. And so the people who take this view would say, what we've got is we've got 6 extended periods of time where God created. And so there we kind of remove the problem of the age of the earth, because these could have been over thousands or millions of years that this creation happened during these days. We remove that problem, but we still hold towards the fact that we're saying what Genesis 1 is saying. Now, I have a lot of friends and people that I respect that hold this view. That said, I'll just personally say, I don't think that there's a lot of evidence in Genesis 1 that supports this view. I think that there's much more of us wanting to try to fit Genesis 1 into scientific consensus. And I'll tell you why I think this view isn't good. I think it's actually the worst of both worlds. I think on the one hand, it makes us say, we've still got to take this literally. We've still got to look at it. It says day, so it means day. Of course, it just means day as a period of time, and it had to have happened in this sequence. So it's got the disadvantage of saying, well, we still got to take this literally and believe that this is a sequence in which this happened. And so problems still remain, like where did we get light before the sun and the moon and the stars? And at the same time, it has the disadvantage of taking Genesis 1 clearly not in the most straightforward way. Now, when the word day is used here, once again, it's possible. There are times that the word day means an extended period of time. But why in the world then is the author saying evening and morning? That's not the way you would talk if you're saying, I'm attempting to teach people that this was an extended period of time. The author of Genesis was not attempting to teach people that this was an extended period of time. I think it's entirely possible he was trying to teach people that this happened in 6 literal 24-hour days. I also think it's entirely possible that he was trying to teach people that this happened and that he's talking about an artistic way. All right, we've got 6 days, we've got a work week, or we've got a week that lasts 7 days, and so this even sets up for the Sabbath. That we have 6 days of work and then we have 1 day of rest. That's what God set up for the Jewish people. So I think there are some ways that the artistic way and the 24-hour day way makes sense. And I'll be honest, because I'm not Mr. Science and looking at those things, I kind of waver between those two views. I might lean a little bit more right now towards the artistic view that seems to make the most sense to me with what I see in this. I also think that it's totally viable that it's the 24-hour day view. If you hold to the day age view, though, that's not anti-biblical. I just think it's not particularly helpful. All right, so there's a little bit on that. But what I want to do now is say this. All right, so if we as a church, if we as LBF Church would say, hey, you can hold the day age view, you can hold the artistic view, you can hold the 24-hour day view, is that us just saying, hey, who cares? Believe what you're going to believe. It doesn't really matter. And the answer is no, that's not what we're saying. We think that what we believe does matter, but there's a core and then there's the less important things. We want to major on the majors. We want to major on the core and say, these are the things that we hold to. These are the things that we would die for. And then there's just the peripheral questions that we'd say, it's okay that we disagree on these. For example, we've talked about this different times with end times issues in the Bible. We as Life Bible Fellowship Church, we would take our stand on saying Jesus Christ is going to physically, suddenly, visibly return to the earth. And when he returns, there's going to be a final physical resurrection. There's going to be a final judgment, and he will usher in the new heavens and the new earth. We take our stand on that. And then when it comes to millennium and rapture and some issues related to that, we debate and we discuss and we have working theories, but we hold to them more loosely. That's the same with some of these questions that we'd say, all right, whether it was day age, more artistic view, but still historical, we wouldn't take our stand on that. So what would we take our stand in? What is the core that we would say, all right, but you got to believe this about Genesis 1, otherwise you are abandoning the text. And I'll talk about a few things. So one thing that I'll mention as far as the core is that I think part of the core is that the God of the Jews is the one and only God. Eventually, where Genesis is driving is that this God reveals himself to Abraham. And if Moses is the one that's writing Genesis, he's preparing the Jewish people to understand who their God is. And what he's telling them is not, your God is one of the gods, but your God is the one and only God. He is the one and only creator. For those of us as Christians, the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ is the one and only God. That is part of the core. If you come away from Genesis 1 and say, I don't think that you need to believe in just one God, you're misreading it. It clearly is teaching one God. And it's clearly teaching one God that created everything out of nothing. It wasn't out of pre-existing material. God didn't stumble along something. God didn't have some beginning where he emerged from something greater than him. There's one God who created everything out of nothing. That's constantly reiterated in the Bible, whereas the days of creation aren't constantly reiterated. There's only one passage, as far as I can see, somebody can tell me if I've missed something, but there's only one passage where the 6 days of creation, the idea of the world being created in 6 days is referenced, and that's in Exodus chapter 31. And the context of that is actually about the Sabbath, saying the reason that we have the Sabbath is because God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested, which some could take and say, well, clearly that means that these were 6 24-hour days. I could also take that and say, well, he's pointing back towards the model of where we got this idea, so I don't know that demands that it would be literal. But either way, there's not. Jesus isn't arguing about this issue. The prophets aren't arguing about this issue. They're not saying it's really, really important that you believe that these were 6 24-hour days. That at least points towards the idea, maybe that's not something that we would major on and say, we are going to talk about this until everybody's on board. But we are going to say, one God created everything out of nothing. And beyond that, what we're also going to say is God created mankind in his image. We as human beings are not simply the end of a long evolutionary process. We are a special creation by the God of the universe. And even beyond that, what we believe is that Adam and Eve were real historical persons. If you look at Jesus' genealogy, it traces all the way back to Adam as a historical person. That's what we believe at Life Bible Fellowship Church. We would say, all right, we believe that mankind is created in the image of God, not just sort of the top of the food chain. And we also believe that Adam and Eve were real people whose actions had real consequences in our lives. All right, that's a little bit of how we take this. And I'll just say in all this, the reason to do this podcast episode on this isn't because we think, well, it's really important that we all believe exactly the same on this, but instead because this can be a real point of conflict where Christians can say, well, I want to believe the Bible, but I'm having a hard time because I don't know if I can believe this. And if you're stuck, if you're saying, well, I want to believe the Bible, but I'm not quite sure I can believe in 6-day creation, I would say 2 things. I'd say, first of all, if you are really going to embrace Jesus, that leads you to embrace the Bible. And if you're really going to embrace the Bible, you're going to have to be ready to embrace things that really take faith for you to embrace. But that said, if somebody said, I'm reading Genesis 1, and I think it's just a more artistic retelling. I don't think it's actually saying that the world was created in 6 literal 24-hour days. I would say, I don't think that you've abandoned the Bible. I don't think you've compromised your faith. So we're talking about it from that standpoint, to say, all right, we don't want people to get stuck unnecessarily. Now, I want to give some resources, because as I said, I'm not the expert on all these things, but I have some books that have really, really helped me. And before even talking about the books, it was probably about 4 years ago, we did a deeper event at Life Bible Fellowship Church where we brought in Fuzz Rana, who works with Reasons to Believe, is a really smart, great guy, loves Jesus, also really knows the scientific stuff. He's actually one of the guys, he holds to the day-age theory, which is one of the reasons why I can't say too many bad things about it, because there are people that I really respect who hold that theory. But he did a deeper event where he talked about faith and science, and I think that you will find it really helpful. It's not specifically about origins, but it is about faith and science, and it's a really beautiful thing. We're going to link to it in the article. of this episode. But then I'll talk about 4 books. 2 of them I've got paper copies of, and 2 of them I'll just tell you about. First of all, Francis Schaeffer's book, Genesis in Space and Time. This is my number 1 recommendation. I love this because it talks about the true implications of Genesis. It talks about, especially within the creation story and about Adam and Eve, as the significance of these events really happening and not just being mythological events. I find this really, really helpful. I believe that it's readable. This might be a little bit challenging if you're not a reader at all, but you know what? We grow when we get challenged. So I really recommend reading this book, Genesis in Space and Time by Francis Schaeffer. And then a second one, Lee Strobel's book, The Case for a Creator. And you might know Lee Strobel was a journalist, and he's written several books like this, The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith. He goes around and talks to experts about these issues. And so he went around and talked to a bunch of experts about the issues related to science and creationism. It's very, very helpful. It's not one that's going to get down into the details of the age of the earth, but it's just going to get down into the true scientific compatibility with the idea that God created everything. A couple more books that I only have on Kindle, so I'm not able to show them to you. One is called Reading Genesis 1 through 2, An Evangelical Conversation. And some of you might be aware there are these different 4 views on this or 5 views on this books that are out there. This is one of those books in that style. So there's not just one author, there's several people talking about things related to Genesis 1 and 2. It's very helpful. It shows you different views. It has them interacting with each other about these views. Very, very helpful. You should go and grab that. And then finally, and this gets less into Genesis and more into the science issue, but there's a book called Undeniable by a guy named Douglas Axe. Once again, as a guy that doesn't delve into the areas of science a lot, I found this very readable and helpful for me to get my mind around different questions surrounding the debates about creation and evolution. So highly recommended. You can just buy it usually you can just get it for $10 on Kindle, or you might be able to find it at the library, but highly, highly recommend it. And I highly recommend that if you have questions, or if you have wrestlings, or if you have disagreements over things in this podcast episode, please leave a comment. And if you don't know how to leave a comment, just go to lbf.church, click on the little tab that says blog and podcast, go to the article associated with this episode, and just leave a comment, leave a question. I'd love to interact with you on that. And also you can download the audio podcast episodes just by searching for LBF Church Podcast, and you can listen to this and other episodes that we have on there. So thanks for taking the time to listen. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.